Alright, hello everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is Monday, March 17th. I'm making this as an eclipse aftermath update kind of thing. We just recently had the lunar eclipse in Virgo. You may notice I'm clean shaven today. A number of things has happened since I made my last video, and I'm basically just recording this to update you on the most recent developments. I felt the impulse to shave my facial hair off, which is something I don't usually do. This was partly, there's something about having a mustache, for me personally anyways, that I started to just let my mustache grow back in like 2017 in the aftermath of Donald Trump being elected the first time. And I have to admit, there was a certain kind of this idea of the multiverse and the alternate timeline, and feeling that we were on some kind of weird alternative timeline, or like, if this is the version of reality that we're in, why not just have a mustache? Like, who cares, right? So that was kind of like my mentality for like having a mustache. I mean, I don't know if eventually it just became like it's easier to just have facial hair than have to shave all the time. But I felt like my face wanted a break from having a mustache, or I can't explain it. I did it impulsively. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I thought I'd just address that because that's probably the first most noticeable thing you may notice. I'm not going to get into the metaphysical problem of the multiverse right now. I'm not sure, but I'm going to say that I'm not sure if I believe it, right? Because if we just stay with this mustache multiverse theory, like, is there another reality that exists where I decided to resist the temptation to shave my mustache on, and in that alternate reality there's a version of me recording this video right now basically saying probably the same things but without the stuff about the mustache, right? And so, like, if that, we can hypothetically imagine that time fractured and fragmented off into another direction. There's another alternate universe where I still have a mustache, and maybe I'm making different choices about what to say in my video. But as far as I'm concerned, that's just a hypothetical, right? Like, unless you can establish contact with that other universe or find a way to hop over to that other universe, what's the point of speculating about it? I don't understand, right? But however, there is the idea of what they call a karmic shift around eclipse season, or some kind of a shift, some kind of a change. I don't know if that necessarily has anything to do with the idea of alternate dimension, or a dimension is also different than a multiverse, right? With metaphysical speculation aside, I'm going to focus mainly on the mundane side of it today. And in my own family life, I was talking about this whole situation dealing with this kind of unresolved grief or unresolved situation with my mother's family, her brother passing away, and all that. And the most recent thing that happened was actually not to do with the family, but actually my mother's horse passed away during the lunar eclipse in Virgo. And to give an update on this, or to give you some perspective about this, that my mother and my sister are both equestrian enthusiasts. My mother what's interesting about this particular thing is that the horse was about 29 years old, so that means the horse was having a Saturn return, and that my mother has been the owner of this horse since 2008. And what is interesting about all this is that the eclipse cycle it takes about 18 years. It takes 18 months for eclipse cycle in each sign, and then 18 years for that process to go through the whole zodiac, right? So there's some sort of timing where, and also keep in mind that my mother is a Virgo, okay? So there's some sort of timing around all of this where if you follow the lunar eclipse cycles, that from my mother owned this horse from one Virgo Pisces eclipse to another, right, for in an 18-year period, and it's pretty like on the dot in terms of astrology, right? There's also, mind you, the influence of Sun, Saturn, Neptune in Pisces on the North Node, and that in astrology, the 12th house was said to be the joy of Saturn, and also ruled over large animals such as horses. So if you factor in the Saturn's influence on the North Node and Virgo on the South Node, and the idea of a kind of a letting go, or things getting old, and that time for things to pass on and stuff like that, and also Saturn ruling, being a signifier for horses and large animals, it all fits the astrology quite well to a T. There's another side of this which I've learned to handle delicately, and maybe I'd be wiser just not to go into it at all. But it's perhaps, if you know anything about horses, another thing about this is that to board a horse, to feed a horse, to care for a horse, to pay for a horse's medical bills, all these kinds of things, is quite expensive, right? And for this reason, I don't consider my family to be poor or impoverished or anything like that. That we're kind of to have a large house and 2 horses and all this kind of stuff. It feels pretty middle class, feels pretty bourgeois to me. I don't mean this in a sort of self-deprecate, but there's some kind of issue around this where I've learned there's also a certain gender coding where I find that if you spend time where people do a lot of equestrian activity, it's kind of female oriented, and there is a kind of there's often some tension around the how things are being budgeted and stuff like that. And this was the kind of thing that, as my mother's son, it's not really my place to judge or criticize her, my family's choice in money or something, but just to say that in the of having 2 horses to pay for, and now you only have to pay for 1, it puts us in a position of much more greater financial ease, right? There's a huge financial burden taken off by not having to pay for this horse, which for all the emotional investment and all the sort of horse owner grief going on, there is a sense of relief in that if things do get more difficult because of the trade war and stuff like that, if financial times are a bit tougher, at least my family is in a better position. So there's a certain silver lining to this whole thing. And I've also just noticed that the Venus retrograde is making this, Mercury retrograde are making a sextile to Pluto, and so that could also go with this whole kind of silver lining when it comes to things that are passing away or whatever, right? So there's a kind of this idea of some big chunk of time, 18-year period, coming to an end. And when we move to the more collective, national scale, there's another event which has happened around the same time, which sort of coincides with all this, in that a man named Mark Carney is our new Prime Minister of Canada, and replacing Justin Trudeau. And of course, he's an unelected Prime Minister, and we are probably heading into an election soon here in Canada. And I would just like to say, first of all, that I know some other astrologers that have more experience in this area who will often make certain predictions about how elections are going to go. And I'm going to basically hold off from making a prediction But instead I'm going to share you just some observations about this, right? Because one of the things is that personally, I'm probably going. I will probably vote for Mark Carney because I don't want to. Like when it comes to voting for Pierre Poilievre, it's like, you know, over my dead body. When pigs fly in hell, yeah, I'll be voting for the Conservative Party. No, I'm gonna vote. Yeah, I'm gonna vote for Mark Carney. But the problem is that like I don't feel like I have a certain. I feel like my desire not to see Mark Carney win and to see Pierre Poilievre lose is perhaps clouding my ability to do a accurate and unbiased, prediction, right? But rather than going to make a prediction, I'm just going to point out that there's a certain significance around Mark Carney in all this, in that in 2008, during the financial crisis, Mark Carney was hired by Stephen Harper as an economist to help Canada through the financial crisis. And so there's a certain kind of thing going on here where for all the mean things or all the, it's an election. Politicians are going to be politicians, but for all the criticisms the Conservatives aim at Trudeau, if they criticize Carney, it's a little bit hypocritical because they're the ones who hired him back in 2008, right? So in some effect, by the Conservatives criticizing Carney, they're criticizing their own leadership and their own hiring practice, because Carney used to work for the Conservative Party, right? So there's that kind of element in it. But there's also, if you remember what I was saying, that there's some weird timing thing. This is the main reason why I decided to put all this together in this video, is there's an interesting synchronicity, the fact that my mom owned this horse from 2008 to just recently. And in that whole cycle, you had the introduction of Mark Carney as an economist working for the Conservative government and all this kind of stuff. And then 18 years later, a whole eclipse cycle later, Mark Carney's back on the scene. And then if you look at Mark Carney's astrology, Mark Carney has this huge stellium in Pisces and Virgo, a full moon in Virgo. So it's like Mark Carney's luminary placements actually line up perfectly with this eclipse season. So there's something about, I don't know if this is the same as saying, you could just say that Mark Carney is fated to appear as some temporary prime minister before the election. I don't know if this is the same as guaranteeing a win for Mark Carney. But if you look at the astrology here, Mark Carney I'm going to, I'll just post a link to this webpage where I'm getting this from. Some other Canadian astrologer did this chart back in, it's actually funny because this is from 2024. So it looks like this whole talk about Mark Carney replacing Trudeau has been in the works for quite a while now. And so people have been talking about it for a while, and this astrologer did the chart up, showing that Carney has Sun in Pisces, Venus in Pisces, Chiron and Saturn in Pisces, and so he's having a Saturn return. When Venus retrogrades back into Pisces, he'll also be having a Venus return. I don't know if it'll actually overlap, but there's he's got Moon conjunct Mars by 1 degree, conjunct Pluto by 2 degrees, conjunct Uranus by 4 degrees. So he's got this huge stellium of Uranus, Pluto, and Mars conjunct the Moon. And these are this is pretty warlike, aggressive kinds of planets to be conjoining his Moon. And so there's something about that which, like, if we are really heading into a era of before we used to be friendly with America, but now there's this weird trade war hostility, and things are there's a big kind of weird karmic shift going on around this eclipse season with Virgo and Pisces, and now we've got a new prime minister who has got a loaded Pisces and Virgo stellium with this Moon conjunct Uranus, Mars, and Pluto. it's like there's something about this which feels pretty appropriate for all the astrology, and it would be I'm tempted to call it, to predict that this could be a win for Carney, just because it fits the astrology so well, right? Carney also has Mercury in Aries, and we're having this Mercury retrograde in Aries right now too, right? And so if you compare that to the competition, Pierre Poilievre, has Sun and Mercury in Gemini, and so you could attribute maybe his recent popularity to this Jupiter in Gemini transit, which is also, if you consider that Poilievre and Donald Trump are both Gemini suns, they've both been having a favorable influence from Jupiter in Gemini, transiting their Sun and Mercury. And it's also interesting that both Poilievre and Mark Carney are Virgos, or they have the Virgo moon, right? But with Poilievre has the Virgo moon conjunct Saturn in the North Node. And that the problem is like when you have the moon conjunct Saturn in the North Node, that is well, it's also it's funny because it's the North Node in Virgo, so like it's the current eclipse is the opposite to what Poilievre has, right? And Poilievre has Saturn in with it, having a well. I mean, the thing is, both of these prime ministers, potential prime ministers, have moons which are afflicted by malefics. With Poilievre, it's a Saturn conjunct moon. With Carney, it's a Mars, Pluto, Uranus conjunct moon. So there's something about the I don't know if I'm going to do the complete analysis all right now. It's also interesting to note that Poilievre has Mercury opposite Neptune and no Pisces placements. Whatever. I'm going to refrain from turning this into a prediction, but I do think there's something interesting the way that this Virgo eclipse season is leading us into a new political era where we're going to have to make a choice between one of two moon and Virgo prime ministers, both with heavily afflicted malefic moons in Virgo. And I want Mark Carney to win. And I'm going to, if I know that there are certain people out there who might not like Mark Carney or have some sort of suspicion about him because he's an economist. And if those people, if you're upset that I'm going to vote for Mark Carney because he's an economist and you don't trust economists, well, I'm going to do it just to spite you, basically. I'm going to like annoy you. I'm going to have that in mind while I'm in the ballot box, that you're going to want me not to vote for him, and I'm going to check the box anyways. Just to spite these people who don't like him because he's like, oh yeah, he's all up with the WEF. He's all up with the elites. He's all up with like, no, I'm going to vote for him anyways just to piss you off. And hopefully he wins. But I'm also I wouldn't be I don't know. It is what it is. Mark Carney seems like a smart guy. He seems like a better leader. He seems like he's going to approach it from a more intelligent perspective than just shouting rhyming slogans, like axe to tax, right? I really do not have much respect for Pierre Poilievre. And so I don't know. With that in mind, I think I'm too biased to make a prediction around this. But there you have it. Anyways, a new era of politics, a new prime minister for Canada. I'm clean shaven. My mother's horse has passed away. I also, this is basically it. There's one more thing about all this, which I have to admit that there is this sort of I kind of this there's also this thing about this the death of my uncle and whether or not we're going my family is going to deal with our relatives and our in-laws, and I just want to like I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm respecting my mother's choice if she doesn't want to deal with her family. Although I have to admit there is part of me to me it contributes to this sense that we live in a society that's very fragmented, that has we've given up on our like social bonds or a sense of responsibility or obligation to each other. But that whole dynamic is actually being influenced by the astrology, it's being influenced by this Saturn-Neptune Pisces. And there's something about, as much as I like Pisces, one of the downsides to Pisces is this problem of people trying to motivate you by guilt, right? And there's something about it where I remember I was first introduced to this idea from a girlfriend of mine who was a little bit of, I don't know, nobody likes to be called a new ager, but you get it. She was a bit of a, you would probably call her a bit of a new ager or a hippie or something. But this idea that like guilt is a waste of energy, right? Like it's this thing that you like produce this big emotion that is like the idea that it's supposed to like the motion of guilt is supposed to influence you to act a different way than the way you're acting. But it tends to just, if anything, make you feel sort of like make people feel ashamed for being independent or like on their own and try to reinforce this sort of obligation, right? Or like the guilt, and it's sort of like that thing about like there's the two sides to it where it's like I feel like on one hand, it's a shame that we have like lost the ties that bind us, the things that hold us together, so that we have a sort of strength as like a community or a family or a civilization. Like we're not just a bunch of individuals out to get each other in this dog eat dog world where nothing means anything, right? But on the other hand, it's like you don't want what holding us together to be this like kind of the guilt of like you feel bad because you don't visit your grandma enough, right? But it's not necessarily because you want to or that you have any certain, there's nothing, it's all because of this like if you don't do it we will make you feel like you're a bad person. And so you always have to be like working, like there's this kind of thing where you're not just okay as you are, you have to constantly be, you're constantly in debt. You constantly have to like pay off this debt, or else you have to suffer this weight of guilt that you've carried around all your life, and no matter what you do, you're never quite free of it, right? And there's this kind of goes with, it's also complicated because I'm reading Nietzsche, I'm reading the Deleuze book on Nietzsche. And I don't know if I don't think I can simply say that I'm on board with the Nietzschean perspective, but this actually does have its roots in Nietzscheanism, because there is the kind of idea of the resentment that people feel for being the independent one or the successful one, or the feeling like you're obligated to be part of the group, part of the family, to do as the family does, to do as your community does, out of this sense of guilt and obligation. And these people, don't have your best interests in mind. They don't want you to be free. They don't want you to be liberated. They don't want, they just want you to carry this burden with them, right? And have you just as trapped in that burden as they are, right? And so with that in mind, I think there's also this kind of issue around a certain, like Saturn being something that has its joy in the 12th house, that is often to do with isolation or prison or something like that. The idea of like how exclusion and isolation and all this kind of stuff can be used as like a punitive measure, right? Or like this idea that like or that we reproduce our own imprisonment out of the sense of like, I don't deserve to be free, I don't deserve to be happy, because I have this big responsibility or this big obligation to some group or some other thing or whatever like that, right? And that this is basically by once you're part of this group, then you join into this sort of like shaming, guilt trip society, which puts that trip on other people as basically just as a means of control or whatever, right? And it's something that you're just like, there's a certain progressive mentality which wants to liberate people away from that, but I'm often, I don't know, I think that I don't necessarily believe, there's something about it where I run into this problem with therapy culture, because I feel like therapy culture has sort of like adopted that as its mentality, that like from the perspective of therapy culture, they don't affirm that thing about like the debt and obligation to family and society. They want people to be liberated and independent and autonomous and all this kind of stuff. But there's something about all this where it's like I feel like there's something about in my mind that kind of reinforces a sense of privilege. Because it's all well and easy to say that, like if you take responsibility for your own life rather than this collective stuff, then what best for your best interest in terms of your own life and your own autonomy and your own freedom and your own agency is to be free and independent and not be weighed down by those obligations and those responsibilities and that sense of debt and guilt and obligation, right? But then the thing is, like, in order to put yourself in that position where you are free and independent and autonomous, it's kind of like this thing that only the most privileged people have access to that, right? Because everybody has some degree of interdependence on, like even if you are the richest man in the world, you're only rich because your wealth is bound up in the business that you are part of, right? And you can say that, oh, I worked my way to the top and now I'm free and I can do whatever. But you can't, because now you have all the obligations to take care of your business. And if you freed yourself from your business, then you wouldn't have all the wealth that goes with that business, right? So it's this kind of thing of like people basically, they don't, there's not, what am I trying to say here? There's something about like, where if you think about people in the most impoverished countries, the poorest places in the world, they are just structurally more likely to be dependent on their family for basic labor, right? And the idea that a progressive society liberates people from all these past structures of social organization, but it's like only something that's achieved for the people who reached the very, very top, right? And so I often feel like it's all well and good for, a therapist to be like, okay, time's up, it will send you the bill, and, so you have to pay these really expensive therapy bills that reinforce the idea of like, I'm the kind of person who has taken responsibility for my own life, meaning I have to make all this money to pay for all this therapy, which is building me up to be this person who can also pay for my own bachelor apartment suite where I'm not beholden to all the guilt trips and obligations of these, or then it becomes like, but then you're never even free because you're an independent person and you're the whole guilt trip is like, you have to do these you have to go back and visit your old friends and family, and or you have this sense of, I think Pisces is all about this sort of nostalgia, sentimentality, this memory. And that you think you're so good because you've become the wealthy elite who has this, who can do whatever he wants, but you forgot where you come from. You forgot your old neighborhood. You forgot your old friends. You forgot your old family. What about the past? Doesn't it mean anything to you, right? You know what I'm saying? Like that kind of tension, or like they have there's some kind of like, now he's he's forgotten his roots, he's forgotten where he's come from, he thinks he can do it all, right? Like he's come completely ungrounded, untethered from the traditions and the salt of the earth that has made him what he was, and now he's just an arrogant prick, right? He needs to come back down to earth, adopt humility, right? Like that is this whole Saturn and Pisces trip. And so there's this sort of like archetypal tension in all of that's kind of distorting things, right? And I think that same thing, that same obligation, is the same attitude which turns austerity and the Christian ideal of poverty into a virtue, right? That it's like, but it's kind of funny because it's a kind of a certain morality which has become almost out of date, right? Because I think it's much more, people in our society, they really reinforce this idea that it's virtuous to liberate yourself from all these previous obligations, responsibilities, and constraints, so you don't owe anybody nothing. And then the old morality, which says it's a kind of hubris to do that you need to know your place in the world and be look after your elders, look after your family, look after all, your own place on earth, and take and be humble. Not be a tall poppy, not be too big for your britches, but like there's these conflicting kinds of morality, where there's like one kind of morality that chastises the person who's successful, and another kind of morality which sees that kind of success as a kind of arrogant narcissism that makes you the center of the universe and all the other people don't exist, right? So like this, and like I more and more I'm at, like, without getting too pulled out into that dynamic, there's some basic issue where I'm afraid of a world ruled by narcissists who are not able to deal with anybody who has a different opinion, a different perspective, a different value system, and that your own liberation is really you just falling a victim to your own narcissism, your own self-infatuation, or your own hubris, your own and so but there's some kind of balance that needs to be struck between those two polarities. I'm kind of working it out, because I think if anything, it helps to see when you get identified with either one of those positions, and it's if you can find a way to sort of like see both of those perspectives, but not align, kind of like try not to align with either of them, and like try to strike a balance between it. Like maybe that's the best option. But I'm just thought it'd be worth mentioning that. I don't know. Maybe I'm just pointing it out because maybe I was getting a little bit swept up in the currents of these Neptunian, Saturnian waters that are very much influenced by these sorts of things of like the grandmother guilt or whatever, right? Or the heavy sense of duty and obligation and all this, right? Or the liberation away from that. Right? Or the drive to that liberation away from that thing, and is that a false ideal or a false virtue, or at least a lower form of the light, right? In the same way that the narcissist or the self-infatuated egoist is a kind of just a lower manifestation of the solar archetype, where there might be a more enlightened version of that expression that we just need to evolve to, right? From a from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, so I think this is basically what I had on my mind for today. Thank you for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Keep on rocking in the free world. Dan's astrology is here to stay.